Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a story that I hope will resonate deeply with you. A story about friendship, resilience, and the quiet power of simply being there for someone. You know, in a world often dominated by noise and spectacle, there are some figures who stand out for their genuine humanity, for the way they navigate life with grace and a profound respect for others. For me, Keanu Reeves is absolutely one of those people. He inspires me not just through the incredible characters he brings to life on screen, but through the consistent, quiet dignity and kindness he embodies off-screen. It is not about grand public declarations or flashy heroics, but about the understated humility, the genuine empathy, and the unwavering loyalty he shows to those around him. There are countless stories out there, little glimpses, that paint a picture of a man who truly understands the value of human connection and the profound impact of being a good, true friend. His ability to listen, to be present, and to offer support without judgment, sometimes without even a single word, is something truly remarkable. Today, we are going to explore a fictional narrative inspired by these very qualities. It is a story about a person facing a deeply personal, darkest hour, not of public scandal or external crisis, but an internal struggle, a moment when the light of passion seemed to dim. And it is about how a friend, with Keanu's unique blend of quiet strength and unwavering belief, helped her navigate that challenging space. This is not just a story, it is a reflection on the power of kindness, the beauty of humility, and the quiet strength of true friendship. I truly believe you will find inspiration and perhaps even a renewed sense of connection within its chapters. So without further ado, let us begin Part 1. Story Part 1. The afternoon light, usually a comforting gold through the cabin's large windows, felt strangely muted, almost hesitant to fully enter the room. Sandra paused, her breath catching slightly in her chest, a subtle, unidentifiable pressure settling just beneath her ribs. She was simply standing by the old wooden desk, her hand resting on a stack of neatly typed pages, but the world around her seemed to hold its breath too, waiting. There was a silence in the air, not the usual peaceful quiet of her secluded mountain retreat, but a heavy, expectant stillness that hummed with a tension she could not quite name. A gentle uncertainty, like a mist, had begun to creep into the corners of her mind, clouding what had once been so brightly clear. She found herself watching dust motes dance in the diffused light, an odd, almost desperate focus on something so insignificant, anything to avoid the weight of the pages beneath her hand. Sandra had always been a woman of boundless energy, her spirit fueled by a relentless passion for storytelling. For years, she had poured her heart into her acting career, bringing characters to life with an infectious enthusiasm and an unmistakable authenticity. But this project, this film she was now trying to direct, was different. It was her heart's truest whisper, a story born from a deeply personal place, something she had carried within her for decades. It explored themes of quiet resilience, the unexpected beauty found in everyday struggles, and the profound strength of ordinary people. It was meant to be her legacy, not just another role, but a direct extension of her soul, a gift she hoped to share with the world. The initial excitement had been a roaring fire, consuming her every thought, every waking moment. She had meticulously scouted locations, assembled a small, incredibly dedicated crew, and poured countless hours into refining the script, ensuring every word resonated with the truth she sought to convey. She envisioned every scene, every frame with vivid clarity, the film already playing perfectly in her mind's eye. However, as the actual production began, as the cameras started to roll and the logistics became a daily reality, a subtle shift occurred. The roaring fire of her initial passion began to flicker, almost imperceptibly at first. The joyous creation, once a spontaneous dance of ideas, had slowly transformed into a methodical, painstaking climb. Each decision, once made with confident intuition, now felt like a monumental effort, weighed down by an invisible burden. The gap between the pristine vision in her head and the sometimes messy, often imperfect reality captured through the lens grew wider with each passing day. The light, which had once felt like pure inspiration guiding her, now seemed to cast long, unfamiliar shadows over her path. She would spend hours staring at the monitor, trying to reconcile the image before her with the profound emotion she had intended to evoke, often finding a chasm instead of a connection. The vibrant spark that had animated her creative spirit seemed to diminish, leaving behind a dull ache, a hollowed-out feeling in the place where boundless energy once resided. She started questioning everything, every shot choice, every line delivery, every single decision she had made. Was her vision clear enough? Was her voice strong enough? The answers eluded her, leaving her adrift in a sea of self-doubt. The relentless pressure to create something truly meaningful, something that lived up to the immense personal significance she had placed upon it, began to suffocate her. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to her crew and her investors, but to the very essence of the story itself, to the untold narratives of those it represented. The fear of failing this story, of not doing it justice, became a heavy cloak, muffling her natural effervescence and replacing it with a quiet, persistent anxiety. She began to dread the mornings, the moments when she had to face the set, to make decisions that felt increasingly momentous and increasingly impossible. The once exciting challenge of directing had become an agonizing exercise in self-recrimination. She found herself retreating, canceling meetings, offering vague excuses, avoiding the very work that had once been her greatest joy. Her vibrant spirit, usually so open and engaged, started to fold inward, protecting itself from an unseen threat, a growing sense of inadequacy that whispered constantly in her ear. One evening, after another day of feeling utterly disconnected from her own project, she sat alone in the living room of her cabin. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fireplace, a sound that usually brought comfort but now merely emphasized the pervasive silence. Her phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, a text message from a close friend. "Hey, yes, thinking of you. Hope the magic is flowing on set." She stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the keypad. The magic. The word felt like a cruel joke, an echo of a feeling she could no longer access. Her own energy, her own well of creativity, felt completely dry, depleted beyond recovery. She considered calling back, reaching out, but the words to explain her despair felt too heavy, too complex, too much of a burden to place on anyone else. She felt an overwhelming shame, a profound embarrassment at her own creative paralysis. How could she, someone who had built a career on intuition and talent, suddenly be so utterly lost? She could not explain it, not even to herself. The truth was, she felt like a fraud, staring at a blank page inside her mind, her once vibrant vision now a faded, ghostly image. She closed her eyes, a wave of weariness washing over her. The weight of the film, of her expectations, of her own identity as a creative force, felt crushing. She was stuck, completely, hopelessly stuck. The project, which had begun as a testament to resilience, now felt like a testament to her own creative fragility. The quiet cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, amplifying her isolation. She wondered with a chilling certainty if she had simply lost it, if the well had run dry for good. The film was slipping away, slowly, agonizingly, and she felt powerless to stop it. She knew she was pulling away from everyone, creating a wall around herself, but the thought of reaching out, of admitting this deep, personal failure was unbearable. A deep, almost primal loneliness settled around her, a cold certainty that she was entirely on her own to navigate this desolate landscape. The chill of the morning, even warmer than usual for the season, seemed to seep into Sandra's bones, a pervasive cold that no amount of heavy blankets or hot coffee could truly dispel. The previous evening's certainty of being utterly alone in her creative vacuum lingered, a heavy cloak she wore even as the sun rose above the distant peaks. She found herself moving through the familiar rooms of her cabin with a newfound hesitancy, each step feeling weighted, each decision, no matter how small, requiring an immense effort. The simple act of choosing clothes for the day or deciding what to eat became a minor ordeal, reflecting the larger paralysis that had seized her professional life. The quiet of the retreat, once a source of solace and inspiration, now echoed with her own unspoken fears, amplifying every doubt and every flicker of self-criticism. The project, once a vibrant organism thriving under her passionate care, had begun to visibly stagnate. Days turned into a week of what her team diplomatically called creative pauses, but what felt to Sandra like a complete, crushing halt. She sent increasingly brief and vague emails, postponing meetings with her cinematographer and lead writer, citing vague revisions that never materialized. Her phone, once a constant source of updates and excited exchanges, now felt like a lead weight, buzzing with notifications she consciously chose to ignore. She would glance at the caller ID, see a crew member's name and let it ring, her finger hovering over the silent button. The thought of having to explain her mental block, of having to articulate the shapeless void that had replaced her vision, was more terrifying than facing any public criticism. She knew her team was dedicated, but how could they help when she could not even help herself? She felt a profound shame, an uncomfortable guilt for leading them down this path, for failing to deliver on the promise she had so confidently made. Meanwhile, miles away, Keanu Reeves had received her almost monosyllabic text, a stark contrast to her usual verbose and often humorous messages. It was not just the brevity, but the complete lack of her characteristic sparkle, her innate light, that had registered with him. He knew Sandra deeply, beyond the red carpets and blockbuster roles, seeing the quiet, thoughtful woman who cherished authentic connection above all else. He had watched her navigate personal triumphs and losses with a quiet strength, always emerging with grace. But this felt different. It was not a public storm which she would meet head-on, but a quiet retreat, a turning inward that spoke volumes. He did not call her agent, knowing it would only add another layer of professional obligation to her already burdened shoulders. He did not bombard her with texts or calls, understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is to respect someone's need for space. Instead, he simply waited and listened in his own way to the subtle silence that began to emanate from her usually vibrant world. He heard small things, a casual mention from a mutual friend about Sandra taking some time for herself that sounded a little too rehearsed. A slightly stressed conversation he overheard between two industry acquaintances about a major project being on hold. He pieced together the fragments, not out of gossip or intrusion, but from a place of deep concern and a quiet, knowing intuition about his friend. He understood the unique pressures she faced, the expectation to constantly deliver, to always be brilliant. He knew what it was like to feel that immense weight, to doubt the very wellspring of one's own creativity. He knew that sometimes, when the noise became too much, when the internal pressure was unbearable, the greatest act of friendship was not to add more noise, but to offer a different kind of quiet. He thought about her remote cabin, the sanctuary she often sought when the world became too loud. And he made a decision, not with a plan, but with a feeling. One crisp afternoon, as the low sun cast long shadows across the cabin's porch, Sandra looked up from her blank notebook, startled by the soft crunch of tires on her gravel driveway. She froze, a surge of mild panic rising within her. She had given strict instructions that she was not to be disturbed. A dark blue vintage motorcycle, instantly recognizable even before Keanu Reeves dismounted, pulled to a gentle stop. He stood for a moment, simply taking in the scene, his gaze soft and unhurried. He was not dressed in anything fancy, just a simple t-shirt, jeans, and a well-worn leather jacket, his posture relaxed, almost casual. In his left hand, he carried a brown paper bag, the kind from a local grocery store, and in his right, a worn, leather-bound book. He did not call out, did not rush forward. He just stood there, a silent, comforting presence, like a sturdy oak tree suddenly appearing on her horizon. Sandra watched him, her initial surprise slowly giving way to a strange, almost overwhelming sense of relief. It was Keanu. Of all people, it was Keanu. He offered a small, gentle smile, a warmth in his eyes that instantly cut through the chill she had been feeling for weeks. He walked slowly towards the porch, not invading her space, but simply approaching with an air of quiet respect. "Hey, Sandra," he said, his voice a low rumble devoid of any expectation or judgment. "I was passing by. Thought I'd drop off some things. You know, the local bakery has those apple tarts you like." He held up the paper bag slightly, a simple, understated gesture. He did not mention her film, did not ask about her creative pause, did not even allude to her recent silence. He simply offered a moment of mundane kindness, a small piece of the outside world, without demanding anything in return. He settled onto the porch swing, taking out the book, a volume of poetry she noticed, and opened it, beginning to read silently. He did not ask her to join him, did not try to draw her into conversation. He just was. He unpacked the groceries, placing a carton of fresh eggs, some artisanal bread, and a few of those beloved apple tarts on a small outdoor table, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The only sounds were the rustle of the pages as he occasionally turned one, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. His presence was not a demand for explanation or an offer of advice, but rather a quiet, grounding anchor. She felt the rigid tension in her shoulders slowly begin to ease, the tightness in her chest softening by degrees. For the first time in weeks, she felt she did not have to pretend, did not have to explain, did not have to justify her existence. She could just be. Hours passed in this shared, comfortable silence. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting a warm glow over the cabin. Keanu eventually put his book down, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. "You know," he said, his voice reflective, "sometimes the best way to find a path is to stop looking for it so hard." He paused, then added, "And sometimes the most important work is just to be still." He looked at her then, his eyes kind, deep, and utterly devoid of pity. He saw her, truly saw her, not as Sandra Bullock, the film director, not as Sandra Bullock, the actress, but as Sandra, the friend. And in that moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the wall she had built around herself, a fragile glimmer of warmth threatening to break through the persistent chill. The stillness of the evening deepened, the colors of the sky mellowing from vibrant orange to a soft, dusky violet. Keanu remained on the porch swing, the gentle creak of the wood the only rhythm marking the passage of time. Sandra, who had been hovering near the doorway, finally stepped out fully onto the wooden deck. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, not against the cold, but as if seeking a physical boundary against the vulnerability she felt rising within her. She sat on the steps, a few feet away from him, pulling her knees up to her chest. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was a comfortable silence, yet charged with an unspoken understanding. Keanu picked up a guitar he had seemingly conjured from somewhere near his motorcycle, an old, battered acoustic with scratches that told stories of its own. He didn't start playing immediately. Instead, he simply held it, his fingers tracing the worn wood, tuning a string here and there with a soft, resonant ping. The act was meditative, deliberate. When he finally began to play, it wasn't a song she recognized, nor was it a polished performance. It was just a series of chords, simple and melodic, hanging in the cool air like questions without needing answers. The music wasn't demanding attention, it was offering space. Sandra found herself watching his hands, the way they moved with an easy, unhurried grace. The notes seemed to drift around them, weaving into the sounds of the forest, creating a small, safe bubble against the overwhelming pressure of her own thoughts. For the first time in weeks, the constant, frantic buzzing in her mind, the script revisions, the budget concerns, the casting doubts, began to recede, replaced by the simple reality of the present moment. Wood, strings, dusk, and a friend. "I used to hate this guitar," Keanu said softly, his voice barely rising above the music. He didn't look up, his focus seemingly entirely on the fretboard. "Bought it at a pawn shop in Toronto years ago. The action was too high, the neck was warped. I fought with it every time I tried to play." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted to play like the greats immediately, but it was just stubborn." He strummed a chord that buzzed slightly, imperfectly. "Then I realized it wasn't the guitar's fault. I was trying to force it to be something it wasn't. I had to learn to play with it, flaws and all, find the sound it wanted to make, not the sound I thought it should make." He let the chord ring out until it faded into silence. Sandra looked at him, really looked at him. His words, seemingly about a cheap instrument, struck a chord deep within her own turmoil. She saw the parallel instantly. She had been fighting her film, fighting her own creative process, trying to force a perfect vision onto a messy, evolving reality. She had been so consumed by what the film should be that she had stopped listening to what it actually was. The realization hit her with a physical force, a sudden loosening of the knot in her chest. "I feel like I'm fighting everything right now, Keanu," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. It was the first honest thing she had said about her work in weeks. "The story, the camera, myself, it's like I'm shouting into a void and getting nothing back." Keanu stopped playing, resting his hand gently over the strings to silence them. He turned to her, his expression serious but infinitely kind. "Maybe you need to stop shouting," he suggested quietly. "Maybe you just need to listen. The void isn't empty, Sandra, it's just quiet, and quiet can be terrifying when you're used to noise, but that's where the real stuff lives." He set the guitar aside and leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You know, when I was working on The Matrix, there were days I felt completely lost, physically broken, mentally drained. I thought I couldn't do it. I thought I was the wrong guy. But I realized that feeling lost is just part of finding the way. You don't have to know the destination to take the next step." Sandra felt a tear slip down her cheek, quickly wiping it away. Hearing him, this icon of stoicism and success, admit to his own vulnerability was disarming. It stripped away the shame she had been carrying. "But what if the next step is wrong?" she asked, her voice small. "What if I ruin it, this story? It means too much to me." "Then you ruin it," Keanu said simply, with a shrug that was somehow profoundly reassuring. "And then you fix it, or you make something else. Perfection isn't the goal, truth is, and the truth is messy. If you're afraid of ruining it, you're afraid of the process. Trust the mess, Sandra. Trust yourself enough to make a mistake." He stood up then, stretching his legs. "Come on, let's make dinner, not because we have to, but because we're hungry, simple as that." He held out a hand to her, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated support. As she took his hand and pulled herself up, a subtle shift occurred. The crushing weight of the director mantle felt a little lighter. She wasn't Sandra Bullock, the visionary filmmaker, right now. She was just a person, standing on a porch with a friend, about to cook a meal. The problem wasn't solved, the film wasn't finished, but the paralyzing fear had cracked. Keanu hadn't offered a solution to her script problems or a strategy for her shoot. He had offered something far more valuable, permission to be imperfect, permission to be human. As they walked into the kitchen, the scent of the pine trees mixing with the anticipation of cooking, Sandra felt a tiny, fragile spark of curiosity return. Not a roaring fire, but a single, flickering candle in the dark. The kitchen, usually a space of solitary, efficient activity for Sandra, now hummed with a different energy. Keanu moved with an easy, unhurried rhythm, chopping vegetables with a practiced hand, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't fuss or give instructions, simply joined her in the task, creating a quiet symphony of knives on cutting boards and water running in the sink. They spoke little, but the silence was companionable, filled with the soft clinking of pots and the comforting aromas of garlic and herbs. Sandra found herself relaxing into the rhythm, her hands working almost automatically, a welcome contrast to the mental gymnastics she had been performing for weeks. The simple, physical act of creation, divorced from the overwhelming pressure of her film, felt like a small, unexpected reprieve. As they ate the simple, delicious meal by the warm glow of the kitchen lights, Keanu began to share stories, not about Hollywood or his massive successes, but about his own experiences with profound creative blocks and the often unseen struggles of artistic life. He spoke of a time when he had taken a year off from acting, completely disillusioned, feeling like he had nothing left to give. He recounted how he had spent months simply riding his motorcycle across the country, sleeping under the stars, reading books, and engaging with strangers. "I wasn't looking for answers," he explained, "just listening to the questions, and when I stopped trying to force creativity, it slowly started to sneak back in, not in grand ideas, but in tiny observations, small moments of connection." He looked at Sandra, his gaze empathetic. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for your art is to step away from it. Let it miss you a little." This was the twist, the unexpected but utterly believable change in her perspective. Sandra had always believed that to overcome a creative block, you had to push harder, work longer, force the muse to return. Keanu's approach was completely counterintuitive to her ingrained work ethic. It was not about more effort, but about less. It was about surrender, about trusting the fallow periods as much as the fertile ones. The thought of stepping away from her film, even for a short time, had always filled her with a paralyzing fear. Fear of losing momentum, fear of appearing weak, fear of confirming her own doubts. But Keanu's quiet wisdom offered a different path, one that felt less like failure and more like a necessary act of self-preservation. It was a profound kindness, not just in his words, but in the implicit understanding that he knew the depths of her struggle, and he respected it enough to offer a gentle, unconventional solution. The next morning, Sandra woke with a clarity she had not felt in months. The fear was still there, a tiny tremor, but it was no longer paralyzing. Keanu was already up, sitting on the porch with his book, the aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. She joined him, a mug clutched in her hands, and watched the mist slowly burn off the forest. "I think I need to take a break," she said, her voice softer than she intended, but firm. Keanu didn't look up immediately, allowing her words to hang in the air, giving them weight. Then he simply nodded, a slow, gentle movement that conveyed complete understanding and support. "Good," he said, turning a page. "The trees do it all the time. They shed their leaves, rest, and then come back stronger." This seemingly simple decision to pause her passion project felt like an immense act of courage. It went against every instinct she had developed over a lifetime in a demanding industry. It meant disappointing her team, explaining her vulnerability, potentially risking the entire project. But for the first time, she felt a quiet strength in her conviction. It was not a surrender to failure, but an act of profound self-respect, a recognition that she needed to replenish her own wellspring before she could pour into others. Keanu hadn't told her what to do, but his presence, his stories, and his unwavering belief in her inherent strength had given her the permission she desperately needed to listen to herself. He had shown her that sometimes, the most profound act of creation is the courage to pause. Over the next few days, Keanu continued his quiet companionship. He didn't pressure her to talk about the film, didn't offer unsolicited advice. Instead, he suggested long walks in the woods, pointed out interesting rock formations, or simply sat with her while she sketched in a notebook, not film ideas but wildflowers and soaring birds. He encouraged her to simply be, to reconnect with the natural world and the simple rhythms of life outside the relentless pace of a film set. He understood that her darkest hour was not a dramatic external crisis, but an internal depletion, a fading of her own creative light. And he, with his profound humility and respect for the human spirit, understood that the way to rekindle that light was not through grand gestures, but through gentle presence and the quiet affirmation of her true self. One afternoon, while sitting by a pristine mountain stream, Sandra found herself laughing, a genuine, unforced laugh that felt like a release after weeks of emotional tightness. Keanu had just attempted to skip a stone across the water, and it had sunk immediately. "Some things," he said with a wry smile, "are just not meant to be forced." Sandra caught his gaze, her eyes sparkling with a renewed sense of humor and lightness. The heavy cloak of self-doubt and creative paralysis had not disappeared entirely, but it had loosened, allowing a sliver of her true, effervescent self to peek through. She realized then that Keanu wasn't just a friend. He was a silent guardian of her spirit, a mirror reflecting back the light she had forgotten she possessed. He was showing her, through his quiet companionship, how to reconnect with the intrinsic joy of simply existing, and in doing so, gently guiding her back to the wellspring of her own inspiration, not by pushing her, but by patiently waiting for her to find her own way. The laughter by the mountain stream, a sound Sandra had not truly heard from herself in what felt like an eternity, resonated deeply within her. It was not a boisterous laugh, but a soft, genuine burst of mirth, a feeling of lightness that settled over her like a warm blanket. Keanu's attempt at skipping a stone, so unexpectedly clumsy, had perfectly articulated the essence of her own struggle, that frantic push against something that simply refused to cooperate. In the days that followed, this newfound lightness became her constant companion. Keanu continued his silent vigil, a reassuring presence, always there but never intrusive. He never asked about her film, never offered solutions to her creative quandary. He simply created a space where she could exist without the crushing weight of expectation. They spent their time immersed in the simple rhythms of nature. Long, meandering walks through the dense forest, where the only sounds were their footsteps on pine needles and the distant calls of birds. Keanu would often stop, pointing out a particularly gnarled tree root, a patch of unusual moss, or the intricate pattern of a spider's web glistening with dew. He spoke of how every leaf, every stone, every tiny creature played its part in the grand symphony of the forest, each unique, each perfect in its own way. These were not lessons but quiet observations, offered with a profound humility that invited Sandra to see the world and herself with fresh eyes. She began to carry a small sketchbook again, not to plan scenes, but to capture the delicate veins of a leaf, the crooked branch of an ancient tree, or the fleeting grace of a deer disappearing into the undergrowth. It was pure observation, devoid of judgment or the pressure to create something grand. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, the sun warming their faces, Sandra received a text message from her production manager. It was a polite, concerned inquiry about her return date, a gentle reminder that the crew was waiting, that schedules were shifting. The familiar tightness in her chest, the anxiety, flickered momentarily. She saw Keanu glance at her, a silent question in his eyes, but he offered no words. He simply waited, his gaze calm and steady. Sandra looked at the message again, then out at the forest, the trees standing tall and silent, perfectly content in their own skin. The fear that had once consumed her now felt smaller, more manageable. She looked up at Keanu. "I need more time," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I need to stop trying to force this. I need to shed some leaves." Keanu's expression softened into a gentle smile, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. He didn't say, "I told you so," or offer any form of congratulation. He simply nodded, his respect for her decision palpable. "The forest will always be here," he said softly, "and so will the story when it's ready." His words were a balm, validating her need for rest, for renewal, without making her feel guilty. This profound understanding, this unwavering belief in her own process, was a kindness that went beyond words. It was an act of deep respect, an acceptance of her vulnerability without needing to fix it. Sandra felt an enormous wave of gratitude wash over her, a warmth spreading through her chest that pushed back the lingering chill of self-doubt. She realized that Keanu had not come to rescue her, but to stand beside her as she rescued herself. Her decision to extend her break, communicated calmly and clearly to her team, was met with understanding, though not without some logistical challenges. She was open about her need for creative space, for a period of introspection away from the pressures of immediate production. Surprisingly, the act of vocalizing her vulnerability, of admitting her need for pause, felt incredibly empowering. It was not a sign of weakness, but an acknowledgement of her human limits, a choice to honor her own well-being. She knew there would be consequences, delays, and perhaps even some skepticism. But for the first time in months, the external noise felt secondary to the internal peace she was slowly, painstakingly cultivating. As the weeks passed, Keanu's presence remained a constant grounding force. He didn't push her towards any specific activity or offer any grand solutions. Instead, he simply continued to share his quiet, contemplative way of being. They would often sit in silence for long stretches, simply watching the world unfold around them. Sometimes he would read aloud from his worn poetry book, his voice a soft, resonant hum that filled the cabin. The poems were often about nature, about endurance, about the subtle beauty of everyday life, and Sandra found herself absorbing their rhythm, their gentle wisdom, without consciously trying to. She realized that Keanu's way of friendship was not about fixing, but about being. He was simply present, a steady, unwavering light in her self-imposed darkness. One rainy afternoon, while Keanu was reading a particularly poignant poem about the changing seasons, Sandra found herself sketching a small bird that had landed on her windowsill. It was a tiny, unremarkable sparrow, but as she drew, she noticed the delicate curve of its wing, the intelligent glint in its eye, the way its feathers ruffled in the breeze. She wasn't trying to capture it perfectly. She was simply observing, simply drawing what she saw, feeling the pencil move across the paper with a pure, uncomplicated joy. It was a moment of complete immersion, a tiny flicker of her old passion completely separate from the overwhelming pressure of her film. She looked up from her sketch, a small smile gracing her lips. Keanu paused his reading, met her gaze, and gave a gentle, knowing nod. He didn't need words, he understood. The internal conflict, the battle between her former driven self and her currently exhausted self, began to resolve into a quiet harmony. She understood that the film was not lost, merely dormant, waiting for her to rediscover her connection to it. She wasn't rushing towards a big revelation, but embracing the slow, organic process of healing and rediscovery. She realized that her darkest hour wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but a slow erosion of spirit, and Keanu's response wasn't a dramatic rescue, but a patient, persistent act of nurturing that allowed her own spirit to slowly bloom again. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for his presence, but for the respect he had shown her process, for the kindness of his unwavering belief. The small, gentle smile that graced Sandra's lips, a genuine expression of peace and contentment, felt like a rediscovery of a long-lost friend. The sparrow, now immortalized on her sketchpad, became a quiet symbol of her return to simple, unadulterated observation. Keanu, with his knowing nod, had again communicated volumes without uttering a single word. His presence had been a profound act of nurturing, allowing her own spirit to slowly unfurl and regain its natural vibrancy, much like a plant turning towards the sun after a period of shadow. She understood now that her darkest hour had not been a public spectacle, but an intimate, internal winter, and Keanu's role had been that of a steadfast, patient gardener. The next morning, Sandra found Keanu packing his modest belongings onto his motorcycle. There was no fanfare, no grand farewell speech. He simply moved with his characteristic efficiency, his movements calm and deliberate. Sandra approached him, a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in months. "You know," she began, her voice soft but clear, "you didn't fix anything." Keanu paused, his helmet in his hand, and looked at her, a hint of amusement in his kind eyes. "No," she continued, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "You didn't come here to fix me or the film or anything. You just made space. You made it safe for me to be broken, and then you just let me find my own way back." Her eyes, now fully alight, met his. "Thank you, Keanu, for being the truest friend." Keanu returned her smile, a rare, open expression of warmth that reached his eyes. "You were never broken, Sandra," he corrected softly, his voice a gentle rumble. "You were just resting, and sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do." He adjusted his helmet, ready to depart. "The story is in you, it always was, just listen." With a final, reassuring nod, he kicked the stand up, mounted his motorcycle, and with a soft rumble, disappeared down the gravel driveway, leaving behind only the scent of pine and a profound sense of quiet gratitude. There was no grand pronouncement of her return to the film, no sudden burst of inspiration that instantly solved all her problems. Instead, there was a quiet, steady resolve, a renewed trust in her own process, and a deep understanding that the film would emerge when it was ready, infused with a depth and authenticity that could only come from this period of profound introspection. Sandra returned to her cabin, but it felt different now. The silence that had once amplified her fears now felt like a fertile ground for growth. She picked up her old script, not with dread, but with a newfound curiosity. She didn't dive into revisions immediately. Instead, she simply read, allowing the words to wash over her, listening to the rhythm, the unspoken emotions, the truth that still resonated within its pages. She realized that the film didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be honest. Her honesty, her vulnerability, her resilience. The story was not just about the characters, it was about the journey she herself had just undertaken. A subtle shift in perspective, a deepening of understanding, a quiet evolution of her creative voice. She saw nuances she had missed before, connections she hadn't dared to explore. The magic hadn't been forced. It had simply found its way back, patiently waiting for her to open the door. Over the next few months, Sandra approached her film with a renewed, calmer energy. She was still meticulously dedicated, still striving for excellence, but the frenetic anxiety had been replaced by a quiet confidence. She communicated openly with her team, sharing her process, inviting collaboration, and fostering an environment of mutual respect and trust. The film took on a new life, imbued with a depth that transcended its initial vision. It became a testament not just to the themes it explored, but to the journey of its creator, a quiet narrative of perseverance, humility, and the profound power of authentic connection. She learned to embrace the imperfections, to trust the process, and to recognize that true strength often lay not in relentless pushing, but in the courage to pause, to listen, and to simply be. The film was eventually completed, a quiet triumph. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it garnered critical acclaim for its raw honesty, its subtle emotional power, and its deeply human narrative. Audiences were moved not by spectacle, but by the quiet truth it conveyed. At a small, intimate premiere, Sandra saw Keanu in the audience, tucked away in the back, observing with his usual quiet dignity. After the film ended and the applause faded, their eyes met across the room. He offered her a small, proud smile, a silent acknowledgement of her journey, of her resilience, of the profound truth she had finally brought to the screen. It was a moment shared between two true friends, a silent testament to a bond forged not in public displays, but in the quiet crucible of shared understanding and unwavering support. In the years that followed, Sandra often reflected on that period, that darkest hour that had felt so overwhelming at the time. She understood that Keanu hadn't merely offered a temporary reprieve. He had gifted her a new way of being, a deeper understanding of herself and her creative process. He had shown her that the greatest act of friendship was not to fix, but to empower, not to lead, but to walk alongside, and not to demand, but to simply be present. Their friendship, a testament to quiet respect and profound kindness, became a steadfast anchor in her life, a reminder that even in the brightest moments of success, the truest treasures are often found in the softest whispers of human connection. It was a story of a true friend like no other who simply stood by, offering the quiet dignity of his presence, allowing her to find her own strength, to rediscover her own light, and to honor the sacred space of her own heart. End of Part 6. YouTube outro 1 to 2 minutes. And so we come to the end of our story. I hope it has touched you as deeply as I hoped it would. What Keanu Reeves embodies in this fictional narrative, and what he seems to live in real life, is a profound lesson for all of us. It is not about grand gestures, but about the quiet dignity of simply being there. It is about the humility to offer support without judgment, the kindness to listen more than to speak, and the respect to allow someone to find their own path. Sandra's journey in this story is a reminder that our darkest hours are not always visible to the outside world. Sometimes, they are internal battles against self-doubt, creative exhaustion, and the immense pressure we place upon ourselves. And in those moments, a true friend is not someone who gives us all the answers, but someone who creates a safe space for us to ask our own questions. Someone who believes in our inherent strength even when we cannot see it ourselves. This story, while fictional, highlights the incredible impact of quiet friendship, of understanding, and of empathy. It shows us that sometimes the most heroic act is simply to sit in silence with someone, to offer a guitar and a comforting meal, or to share a simple observation about a skipping stone. It teaches us that true kindness is often found in respecting another's process, in giving them the grace to be imperfect, and in trusting their capacity for resilience. I truly believe that if we all embraced a little more of Keanu's quiet wisdom and Sandra's courageous vulnerability, our world would be a much kinder, more understanding, and more inspiring place. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.